my first guest this morning is Tim Samuels, who has really, I think, made a big dent in this tipping point moment when you're allowed to talk about boys and men and really explore. Because Tim's a broadcaster, a writer, a commentator, but famously and importantly, I think, he started Men's Hour on the BBC, which again had that sort of why do men need an hour thing. But if for those of you who tune in, or those of you who don't, let me tell you the subject matter is very far-ranging, it's been very important, and Tim's been part of a group of men who've supported and helped think through what should this festival be. So we're going to talk together about what drives him forward in this whole debate about being a man. And here he is, Tim Samuels. And one of the things we should say is we debated about the title of this talk, and I loved the fact that you landed on this thing, Set Our Testosterone Free. I thought that was a very, come out and say it thing. And I just wanted to start with that question really, which is why you think that title expresses some of the kind of desire you've got to have the conversation in a different way.
Thanks, Jude. I mean, and also Jude's... there are a lot of times when I've just been writing a book about being a man, which has sort of pulled together a lot of the thoughts I've had in the last few years, and realised there were some thoughts. With radio, you can sort of get away with it. And most of the time you say, what are you doing? I'm writing a book about being a man. And there's a kind of arched female eyebrow that gets raised at that point. And you sort of have to, at that point, you have to hit people around the head with a barrage of statistics of, male suicide rates to homelessness to prison, at which point by the end of it they're sort of slightly browbeaten and the eyebrows come back down. But all along Jude and the Southbank, the eyebrow has been sympathetic. One of the few people out there who sort of embraced the fact that, as Jude was saying, male power, the fact that men are very dominant in society, doesn't equate to individual male experience being a bed of roses. And in terms of set our testosterone free, it was just a sort of thought which is, there is this kind of vital masculine force which we don't really recognise in society, which when it's harnessed can do great things. It can drive men to huge success and really tap into their competitive instinct and become sort of world leaders and Nobel-winning scientists and all sorts. But when it's not harnessed, it can become incredibly destructive as a force, and inwardly sort of drive people into sort of depression, and outwardly into anger and violence and embracing far political parties. And there was just this sense that actually we do need to take a step back and say, we are men, we've existed for thousands of years in a certain way, our bodies are still wired in that way. We need to just be able to embrace and engage and indulge that we are men, not in some sort of weird 70s style Neanderthal retro thing, but just in terms of letting good masculinity out.
Okay, I mean that's a great phrase, good masculinity. I want to pick up on something that Kelly said yesterday, which I thought was really helpful. She said, gender is who you are when you go to bed, and sexuality is who you're in bed with when you wake up. So she was saying, the issue of gender is not about what your sexual preference is. And I think that this is a really kind of key thing, because it means that if you gender as masculine, or gender as feminine, there is something about that which is a knowledge, a beingness, but it's hard to pin down, but obviously it exists. So we don't seem to, because the female has been phrased through words and styling into something which has words attached like passive and docile and all of those sorts of things which puts it in the power structure lower. You can see why the fight back has been to deny gender difference, I'll put that way. And who knows where gender difference finally comes from, because we've got a lot to learn, yes, about neuroscience and biology generally. But in the gender different world, how does the conversation about good masculinity happen? How are people exploring masculinity as a concept, separate from it, then giving it a power base?
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of thing where people, it always feels like a cop-out to say, well, it's my biology. You know, one of the things I've been looking at is monogamy, and whether, you know, men are naturally meant to be monogamous or not. And just to reduce the tone on a Sunday morning, the size of a man's testicles is, relative to other apes, indicative that we're sort of meant to be kind of not necessarily monogamous.
What we're don't feel afraid about discussing testicles. No. I'm up for this. What do you mean the size of them suggests a relationship to monogamy or not?
Well, if everyone could have a good look and look at your person next to you. No. Chimps have... I'm going to manspread, make this easier. Chimps have very large testicles, and they are incredibly rampant, and they need it, and they're kind of competing. Compared to gibbons, which have smaller testicles and have a much more sort of monogamous way of life, and looking at gorillas as well, there seems to be a correlation between testicle size and the one's need to sort of spread it around. And the based on that, and also of sort of physiology and sort of leg and height ratio, it's inferred that naturally we're meant to be slightly polygynous, which might be one man and a couple of women, which is great for the men that can pull that off, and for the guys who get left behind. They're in trouble, and it produces conflicts, and they're more likely to kind of go off to other societies, which isn't great when you're nation building. And this, you know, exists in a lot of sort of earlier societies and in the odd society around the world. But of course, you know, if you come back and you know you have an affair and you say to your missus, I'm really sorry. Look at these, you know, the comparative size of my testicles compared to other members of the ape kingdom. That ain't going to cut. So on the one hand, you know, it's sort of seeing how are we wired and what are we up against. You know, it's not to say it's totally dominant and we're beholden to our physiology, but it's interesting to know that what are we up against. And if you look at the kind of divorce rate and the fact that, you know, in every society around the world that you know, infidelity is a thing, then maybe we should start to factor in that, you know, men do have this wiring, and you know, it should be part of the discussion. On a sort of different note, bringing up boys at school, huge thing. You know, boys falling behind at school. In every OECD country, their reading age is lower than girls. Girls more likely to get to university. You know, boys 6 times more likely to have ADD at school. You know, all this sort of thing. You know, boys. There's a real problem with boys at school. You know. But we have to look at the sort of physiology of boys. You know, they are designed to be more active and run around more. And when they are in the womb, they get washed in androgens, which are male hormones. And some people say that, you know, they need to be active and they need to be kind of running around more. So you have to maybe factor that into education, and not have passive learning where boys are just sort of stuck in classrooms all day. So there is a way, I think, of bringing in how we're designed, how we've lived for the last 12,000 years since we kind of took up farming, and factor that into today's society, which for me seems a bit out of kilter. You know, when you're a man sat at an office all day, it's just so not how you're designed to be. You know, you should, and you know, you have your flight and fight responses get triggered by emails or seeing a boss, or you know. The instincts are there, but the lifestyle is out of kilter to how we're designed.
I mean, what you're saying about constraining men, if you like, I'll come back to monogamy in a minute, but just the sort of physical constraint of educational norms of sit at the desk and do your copywriting, which is, from the Industrial Revolution onwards, basically education was sit at the desk, learn to write properly, learn to add up, etc. It was nothing to do with men and women. It was to do with the way that society wanted to educate workers. So that tradition has carried on. Obviously, girls have entered the field, and as you say, education seems to be working for them for a while, less than boys. But is it the Industrial Revolution that created an idea of men working in a different manner, and the office worker and so on? So are the problems that men are experiencing to do with modern society?
Yes, I mean, I think it's important. I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's not some sort of backlash against women or feminism. It's not, for me, I think the greatest threat to men, masculinity, happiness, sanity is employment and work and how we work and kind of corporate life. So, and that sort of goes back to schooling. When there was a reaction against it. When at the end, sort of late Victorian era, it was felt that boys were being too feminised. There were feminine teachers and they were too passive. So muscular Christianity kind of abounded, and you become a man by putting your head up another bloke's arse in a rugby scrum. That was how you become a man, and that's how you build imperial values. And before the Industrial Revolution, men were artisans. They kind of often looked that they didn't have bosses. They weren't part of this kind of corporate structure that beats out certain male characteristics. You're not going to get ahead in today's corporate world if you don't suppress who you are as a man. In some ways good, but possibly too far. And open plan officers are death by 1,000 hushed conversations. So and work is so important to men and male identity and who we are and how we think. And Jude and I were just talking before about the sort of terrible male suicide rates, and that's been something which has really focused the fact that men aren't these tough, all dominant, everything's fine characters. And there was a real spike during the recent recession in men taking their own lives. And there's such a tragic correlation between how we're doing at work and how we feel about ourselves. Our identities are so tied up in our jobs, and it's sort of not surprising, really. That's where you get status and validation. It's where you get money. It's what you do all day. We have this need to be productive, but are we being productive? We don't really produce anything anymore. We don't really use our hands. And when you see the kind of man crushed on the tube in the morning, going to work to sort of hunch over an office desk and keep a middle manager happy, he needs his testosterone liberated.
Okay, so you're really making a powerful argument for modern society trying to put a square peg in a round hole, almost. You're saying that I'll say the man, but there's another debate as well about you're talking about the whole human, but it's certainly in terms of the man's energy, the gender need is being organised and to fit in with a kind of productivity that is unsuitable. It's not giving men interior landscape. It's not giving men physical outlets, etc. Why isn't that discussion something that is happening in a kind of broad, open way, since men have the opportunity in the newspapers, in the media, everywhere really, to speak out about anything? They dominate the arena for the media. So why is it such a tentative territory, being able to talk about men's needs?
I think it's quite strange for men to think of themselves as a cohort. It's almost a bit like when you are the dominant group, you sort of don't identify. So and when you do, it often comes across as a bit weird. So when you have people talking about English votes for the English, or whites being sort of repressed in this country, it sort of think the natural reaction is, well, what are you talking about? And I think with men, there's a sort of it's just not on our radar. There's no tradition equivalent to feminism, and whenever there has been, it's been a bit weird. Mm-hmm. And meninism's a sort of slightly strange concept. I think for men it's much more of an individual experience where they would just get home and feel a bit exhausted, or feel the need to go to the gym, or not hold down a marriage, or drink too much, or go and have a fag, or have a fight. I think it just sort of comes out in that sort of individual way. And you know, till I sort of finished the book, I hadn't quite connected the dots of what this kind of masculine force was. From, you know, I knew there were individual instances where things weren't, you know, where there was work and there was mental health and there was violence. But for me, it was quite a realisation as well. So I just don't think it's men wake up in the morning and feel part of something. They feel sort of an individual experience and maybe a family experience.
I mean, it's worth at this point, I think, talking about a few statistics, even though some of you, you know, are very familiar with them. It's a cause of huge worry, we know, around, you know, rape and violence to women, that the statistics are so high. But equally, if there are 12 or 13 men in this country killing themselves every week, that is horrific. And only recently are we beginning to say, well, hold on a second, you know, shouldn't we care? Shouldn't we do something about that? And obviously violence against women is horrific, but it is horrific to be a perpetrator of violence because something is happening to that man which is completely distorting their ability to live. You know, that's the victim is terrible, but we can't just evade the fact that this level of violence is something that is being perpetrated against the happiness of men. So why do you think, okay, you've said that we haven't sort of wanted to attend to it because we thought, well, they don't need anything, but suddenly these issues have started to be talked about. Is it suicide that's triggering this debate?
I think that's the starkest. It's the starkest statistic. It's the one which is unanswerable to. And it's, for me, it's the sort of, you know, it's the visible bit of the iceberg. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, you go beyond that and you think, well, 95% of the prison population is male, 95% of rough sleepers are male. You know, interestingly, at the other end, 95% of FTSE CEOs are male. And what you know, there is that sort of, when I was talking about sort of good and bad masculinity, there is that male tendency to either kind of really achieve or really sort of mess up.
Plummet.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you know, when men have got the sort of when that energy is being harnessed, you know, that's when they are becoming global leaders and they're winning most of the Nobel Prizes and they're, you know, there's a glass ceiling and all that, but even with that, you know, to minds, men are really overachieving, but they're also really overachieving on everything that you don't want. And in ways which you wouldn't expect, you know, in terms of male eating disorders are a slightly unknown concept, but are rising as well. And also, you know, the statistics suggest that about 40% of domestic violence is committed against men, which is a really strange and unreported statistic as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, the kind of territory that often gets entered into is that men's problems are created or exacerbated by arguments around gender equality. So the sort of, you know, feminists are doing this to me feeling, which, you know, is, I won't say it's prevalent, but it exists and it's loud. You know, it's loud on trolling, it's loud on Twitter, etc., which is, you know, if it wasn't for women, men could get on with being men, it would all be okay. But obviously if women start saying, well, I like to work, I like to achieve, you know, I like to play football, you know, etc., etc. If women start saying, well, these are things that aren't just male, they're human, that displacement of role, how much do you think that is accounting for men's frustration, anger, bewilderment?
I mean, broadly, I think, you know, feminism has been a good thing for men, not least because it's allowed men to become better fathers. And having sort of been nudged into spending more time with kids, I think a lot of men have found that they like that and are spending much more time with children and have a much more emotionally present relationship with kids. And again, you know, I think on that kind of macro level, it gets a bit lost. But on the micro level, on the family unit, men, I think are really, generally it's great when you want your female partner, to be happy and fulfilled and free and not constrained, and dual income, and there's lots and lots of benefits to it. I think one thing I think is that male space has been eroded. Again, in that sense of, I think it's really important, for example, that men spend time with their male friends. Mm-hmm. There's been a survey, admittedly it was sponsored by Guinness, which suggested that if men spend 2 nights a week with their male friends, they're more likely to overcome disease and resilience. And it's an argument I use on my friends' wives to try and let them out to see me once a week, and it doesn't really work anymore. But your husband will be healthier, please come. But I think there's something in that. It used to be, Friday night was men in the pub with each other, then Saturday night the missus came along. It doesn't have to be like that. Football was this sort of pure distilled place where men could be men, and now, it's not so much the presence of women, it's the gentrification of football, and the kind of a sort of prawn sandwich thing, which has eroded that. But I think, I don't think women are this threat, but I just think it's about just saying men need a bit of man space and man time to be with each other. And I think, there was another survey which was slightly more rigorous in Glasgow, where they found that it was men going to the pub was very important for their mental health, though not their physical health.
Yes, that's interestingly, we were talking to counsellors yesterday. Obviously, Samaritans are here and counsellors are here and so on. And they were saying that men generally, only 11% of men, I don't know how they find these statistics, but only 11% of men felt they had someone they could ring if they were in trouble. They had a man they could ring if they were in trouble, only 11%. Wow. So the issue of male friendship, presumably, if you're all together in a very, very important community like the army, or the forces, or miners, or a group who are absolutely reliant on each other as comrades, then I can see how male emotional friendship gets engendered, because you can't pretend you haven't got that. But male friendship in offices and male friendship in sort of, at the BBC, they seem less easy to develop for men, as far as that's what men say, that they might have a bantering relationship or a drinking relationship, but they haven't got an emotional language relationship. Is that true?
Yeah, I think, in an open plan office, there are limits to, the sort of bonds that you can form. And, for me, the deep friendships from work have come when you're away filming and you're on location together and you have that time and that experience. But there is something about being with a group of men, old male close friends, where it just gives you that perspective. You can be having the worst week in the world, and someone can just take the piss out of it, and at that moment diffuse it, and everything feels reset and fine and good. And I'm just an advocate of creating a little bit of space for men to be able to be with each other, and also, likewise, I think it's probably important for women to go out with their friends, and
absolutely,
not always, not for couples to always do everything together.
Yeah, there's two things that you've said. One is that there are areas of men's experience or propensity that might feel they would still like to do that, and then coming in an opposite direction is society as a whole, moral society, which isn't just women's voices, but sort of moral society, and also partnership that goes, well, you might feel like doing that, but I don't want you to. So there's the issue of negotiation and what that feels like, and whether that actually ends up being a kind of prison that women and men have as an issue. But then there's also, you're saying, modern society that is sort of boxing men in a way that's actually destructive to them. And it's interesting because even places like where men are still doing kind of agricultural things, when they're working as farmers, they're working on the land, they're working in construction sites and so on. However, the evidence there is still that the violence, the drinking, the self-harm, it's still on the rise. So there seems to be something beyond modern urban office life that is actually about identity in a greater way.
Yeah, and economic security. Farmers really struggle with a way of life which is disappearing.
And the thing that has come up again and again about suicide is men didn't feel they could talk to anybody, but also they felt responsible, totally personally responsible for being a success. And if they weren't a success, then there was nothing going for them. And I don't know that women feel that they must define their success in quite the same way. Obviously, it has been typical to define your success through being a mother, and that is shifting as you recognise that not everybody wants to be, not everybody can be, not everybody should be, and there are other choices. But for men, defining themselves as successful still suggests a public role of some kind. Is that still true?
Yeah, and I think part of the pressures of life are that if you're in your 17th century village, you're doing quite well in your sort of artisan trade or whatever you're doing. You're fine. Who else are you judging yourself against? If men are wired for competition, you're doing all right in your village. But now everything that you do is held up against cinematic images of men, social media images of men, and we have this kind of our expectations when we wake up in the morning are so different to if you think what the expectations would have been of our grandparents or our great grandparents, they would have been maybe along survival or making ends meet, or if they were particularly competitive, they're judging themselves against a few peers. But our expectations are, we're judging ourselves against a sort of infinite number of men and a very absurd impression of what success can be, and I think that's true for men and women. Yeah,
those men's spaces that you've referred to as sort of slightly comic 70s, I do happen to know that some men I know who've been on them have found them incredibly helpful. So on another level, I would just say that any exploration is trying to find some truth. And it might look weird to somebody, but it might be right for somebody else. It's not so long ago that we said therapy was kind of a weird thing that only Americans did. And now, thank goodness, we're able to say, well, actually, no, it's not that weird. It's just called talking and finding out stuff. So I think that the exploration of masculinity is at last something where the tipping point seems to have arrived where it's allowed. And I'd like to end by saying that Tim's been really in the forefront of allowing this to be because of Men's Hour, and you've put yourself in a very frontline situation. I know you've had lots of people kind of accusing you and prodding you and rowing with you, but you're obviously up for it. So Tim Samuels, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jude.